Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. So in this tutorial we will see and learn about Spring Interceptors, what exactly is Spring Interceptor and what's the concept behind this, and with code we will see and run this. Okay, so let's start. So basically Spring Interceptor is used to run between the request, while the difference with Spring Filter is or Servlet Filter is that Servlet Filter we use to run before rendering our view. So there's a major difference between the Spring Interceptor and Spring or Servlet Filter. So basically Interceptor is actually a class and we can use that by either implementing the handler interceptor interface or extends the handler interceptor adapter. So the adapter is an abstract class and does not need to provide us the implementation of its method, while the other interface we need to provide. Okay, and override all those method. So going back, like what exactly is this servlet filter or interceptor is? Basically filters are part of those web servers. Okay, and we use filters in servlets projects or basically in Spring MVC projects. Okay, but if we are working with filters and working on MVC applications, so if any incoming request comes, so we can use those filters to manipulate and even block requests from reaching any servlet. Okay, so we must have seen filters in Spring Security. It's a great example where we use filters or concept of filter chain for authentication and authorization to configure a Spring Security. We can simply use and add one single filter, that is the delegating filter proxy, and Spring Intercept can then intercept all incoming and outgoing traffic. Okay, that's why we can make use of Spring Filter. So I have also created one Spring Filters or filter video, so you can watch that video and you can see how filters work with code and examples. So coming back to our topic, so that was about the filters. So the difference between like the filter and interceptor, both of almost same, but there is a difference. Filters intercept request if they reach the dispatcher servlet. Okay, making them ideal for core screen tasks such as authentication. You want to authenticate a user before reaching your controller or servlet or any API. Logging we can do. Okay, but on the other hand, interceptors basically, as a name suggests, intercept the request between the dispatcher and the controllers. Okay, so interceptor is basically used for pre-processing and post-processing of our task. Okay, so this can be done within the Spring Boot or Spring MVC framework, basically by providing access to the handler and model and view objects. Okay, so let's see within diagram what exactly intercept look like. Okay, so if you can see this diagram, in this diagram, this is a Tomcat web server. Okay, and we can see that filter is on top of it, and above this is servlet, then interceptor and controller. So interceptor, like I have told you, comes between this dispatcher servlet and controller. Okay, so basically interceptor intercept the request between these two. Okay, now let me show you one more diagram. So yeah, this diagram, so you can see on this diagram we have filters up there. So any incoming request is coming, so it will handle by filters first. So filter, suppose I have added one authorization filter. Okay, so it will check first that request whether or not the user and the correct user has been logged in, or he has entered the correct password. After authorizing that, the request will be passed on to the dispatcher servlet, and after dispatcher servlet the request will be passed on to controller. But if I put my handler interceptors or interceptor in between the request, then this request will first be pre-handled by my handler interceptor. And interceptor, suppose I wanted to check whether or not certain information or token or any key, the user key has been passed over the API or not in the header. So I'll be using the interceptor in between the dispatcher servlet and controller. So let's go back to the Spring MVC handler and try to understand like how this works. Okay, so the purpose of the handler mapping, if you can see on this diagram, is basically to map a handler method to a URL. Okay, so if we can see this, the dispatcher servlet basically uses the handler adapter, okay, to invoke the method. Okay, so in short, if you can see, interceptors intercept requests and process them. They try to avoid repetitive handler code such as logging and authorization checks again and again. Okay, so if we can see this diagram, we see like first the request will be received by dispatcher servlet, then the dispatcher will take this to the handler mappings, and the mappings will get to know about the controller task name associated with that request, and then the request transfer to the controller, and then controller process this request by executing the appropriate method, model and view or model attribute or whatever data has been associated with it, dispatcher servlet. Finally, dispatcher servlet sends the model object to view resolver to get the view page, okay, using that model and view or model attribute if we are using in parameters. And finally, dispatcher servlet pass the model object to the view page. So this has been the flow, but in between this dispatcher and controller we will use our interceptor. Okay, so interceptors are basically used to intercept client requests. Like I have told you, sometimes we want to intercept the HTTP request and do some processing before handling it to the controller handler or after. Okay, so one or some examples are like processing can be logging for the request, or if you want to check in on the header, like if some token is there, or some, if you want to do some authorization or some validation checks on the API, so we can also do. Okay, so to use interceptor in Spring MVC, we need to add this dependency Spring Web. Okay, but if we are using in Spring Boot project, we need to add Spring Boot Starter Web. Okay, so this is the internal working of Spring. Like a request has been come, and there are three methods we are going to use in interceptor. The one is pre-handle, post-handle, and after completion. Okay, so request sends, and then interceptor is there between dispatcher and controller, and it will intercept those requests. Okay, so these are the three methods that we are going to use, and let me tell you something about all those three methods, like what exactly these three methods are and how we are going to use. Okay, so our first method is pre-handle. So this method is basically called before handling a request. It returns true to allow the framework to send the request further to the handler method. The second one is post handler. This method basically is used to perform some action on responses sent to the client. Okay, so this hook basically runs when the handler adapter is invoked, the handler, but dispatcher servlet is yet to render the view. Means view hasn't been rendered yet by the dispatcher servlet. Okay, and the third method, after completion, when a request is finished and the view is rendered, we may obtain some request and response data. So then this method is we are going to use. So as the name suggests, like pre-handle, I wanted to handle the request before reaches to the controller. Okay, post handle, this method suggests like post handle, I'll be using this method after the request has been sent to the controller, and I wanted to perform some action on the responses. I wanted to send that back to the client, so I want to perform some action on that response, so I'll use post handle. And after that, and if I receive the request, I check the request, I send the response back to the client. Then if anything I wanted to perform on that actions after request and response, then there is after completion method. Okay, so now let's move toward the code part and see how this interceptor is going to work. Okay, so I have just built one small project on Spring Boot and added one small controller here. And okay, so I'm just going to run this controller first and see if there is any interceptor in it or not. Okay, so I have started my Spring Boot application and I'll try to run my REST API that I have created here. I'll be running it on Postman. Let me type localhost 9090 as I have changed this. So get data. Okay, so my API has been running, but I haven't used any interceptors. Okay, so I'll read directly get the response, but if I use the interceptor, that will intercept this request, okay, before reaching to my controllers. Okay, so to create interceptor or to add interceptor, we will first be using the spring intercept sorry we will be first be using the handler interceptor. Okay, so I'll be first creating one class and then I'll be implementing the handler interceptor. Okay, so let me create one class. Okay, I'll be creating one class request interceptor, and I'll be moving this to the package interceptor. Okay, let me also create a package here, interceptor, not in the controller. I want this to be outside the controller, and I'll be moving this to interceptor package. Okay, so now I'll be implementing this with handler interceptor. Okay, so the reason behind using handler interceptor and not handler interceptor adapter is handler interceptor adapter is basically deprecated in Spring Boot 2.4 version. So I'll be suggesting you use handler interceptor. Let me open this. So you can see this class, this is an interface handler interceptor, but after Java 8, this has been marked as default. So it's not for us to override each and every method, because these methods are marked as default and we can see a method body. But if these methods are not marked as default, then we have to use handler interceptor adapter, because you must have known the concept of adapter classes. Okay, so moving forward, I have implemented the handler interceptor, and now I'll be using my method. Also, let me also mark this component annotation so that it will auto void, and it will so that the bean creation would be done automatically after using this annotation. Okay, so let me just override its method boolean preHandle. So I'll be handling the request before it reaches to my controller. Okay, let me override this also. And okay, so okay, there is HTTP servlet request inside this. Okay, and response also. Okay, so what will I do in this method, preHandle method, is I will be using a condition where I'll be expecting some authorization key in my header. So if the user sends that authorization key while requesting to my endpoint, then I'll be authenticating that request and I'll be sending that request to my controller. If I didn't get that authorization key or token or anything in the header, then I'll be throwing an exception. So I'll be also creating one custom handler exception class. So let me first create that condition here. Okay, so let me add that condition here. If I'll be also using string utils dot is blank request dot get header, so http request dot get header is blank, then I'll be throwing the exception. So I will be expecting employee auth key in the header. Okay, and if this is blank, then I will be throwing an exception. So I'm just going to throw the exception here, and let me also add the method signature, or else return true. Okay, so what will I do in this request is, if string utils is blank, means I will be expecting this authorization key in my header. If this authorization key comes in the header in the request, then I'll be forwarding this request to the controller. Otherwise, I'll be throwing an exception. So In the meanwhile, I have just created the exception class, parent class. So let me also create the custom exception class also that will be throwing at the runtime. So let me create one package exception, and inside that exception package I will be creating one class that will be invalid header file exception. Okay, and I will be extending this with runtime exception. Okay, and let me just add private static final long serial version ID. This should be in camel case. Variable name, and then I'll be adding one message, private string message, and just one controller. Inside this I'll be using my message this. Okay, let me also create getter and setter. Okay, generate getter and setter of this. Okay, and let me just set this here, this dot set message. Okay, perfect. So I have just created my custom exception class, so this will handle any custom exception occurs while intercepting the request. So let me also throw this custom exception class here. Instead of writing the parent exception, invalid header file exception, and inside this my message would be invalid request. Okay, so if the user sends this request, and if I didn't get this authorization key inside the header, then I'll be throwing the exception. Okay, so after creating the interceptor and adding the handler methods, we also need to create a configuration class. So you can see in this handler interceptor interface, we can see all those three methods. Pre-handle is there, post-handle is there, after completion is there, and we can also make use of handler interceptor adapter. Okay, but this class has been deprecated, and I'll not be using this class. Okay, so I'll be using this handler interceptor because I'm using Spring Boot 3.0 version. Now I will be creating my configuration where I will be registering my interceptor. Okay, so we need to register this interceptor before using it. So inside this config package, I will be creating one Java class security config. Okay, so inside this config class I will be registering my interceptor. Okay, so I will mark this class as configuration. So using this annotation, multiple beans can be registered here, and I will be implementing this with webmvc configurer. Okay, earlier we are using webmvc configurer adapter, but this class has also been deprecated. So instead of this adapter class, I will be using web mvc configurer interface. And similar to handler interceptor, in this interface also several methods has been marked as default, so we can use any method we wanted to use because all these methods have now body. Okay, so let me just go back to my security config, and let me just auto wire my request interceptor, and let me just override one method to add this interceptor in the registry. Okay, and I guess interceptor registry, yes, interceptor registry, and let me just create this add interceptor. and inside this I will be adding my request interceptor. Okay, so we have created my registry class and I have added this registry. Inside this registry I have added my interceptor. So now I'll be running my application again. So I have started my application and I will be sending the same request again via my postman application. So let me send this. So you can see 500 error is there, and let me just see the exception up there. Okay, invalid header file exception. You can see exception has been thrown here, invalid request is there, because I have successfully added my interceptor here that now is intercepting the request before going to the my controller, and now I have to use my authorization key here, or it is expecting that header. Okay, so I will be adding that auth key in my header and I will be adding value as 1234. Send. Now hello Java is there and it has intercepted the request and it found that authorization key in the header and it validated the request and it passed to the controller. So using these methods in interceptor we can make use of intercepting any request. Okay, alongside, suppose if you added this interceptor here in the registry and there are several other requests up there in interceptor, but what I have added in this request interceptor class is whatever the request is come. Okay, whatever request comes and goes from dispatcher to controller, every request we I'm expecting this header key. But in some requests, if I don't want to accept this header key, then I can also add that check in my add interceptor. In this registry I can add those checks where I don't want to check for that authorization key in the header, so we can also add so in this box. Okay, and suppose if you wanted to work with XML files, then you can also do so via the configuration. Suppose I have wanted to exclude some path patterns. Suppose I wanted to exclude these two path patterns. Okay, login or any other method, then I can also do so. Okay, so we can also do so by excluding some paths and excluding the preHandle or interceptors in those APIs. And suppose if you are working with configuration file, then you need to add interceptor registry using this format. Okay, so using these ways, either with configuration or with annotations way in the class, you can add those interceptor in your Java class. Okay, so basically this is a one scenario where you can use how we can use Spring interceptors while intercepting our request from dispatcher to controller. Okay, so that's it for today guys in this video. If you have any comment, to comment over this. If you have any suggestions or want any video on certain topic, do comment and I'll try to make that. So